This looks like the coffee cups.
Alrighty, everybody. Well, welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Andrew Daphne. I'm the Instruction and Outreach Librarian at the New Jersey State Library, and it is my pleasure to present our speakers for today, Linda Stamato and Sandy Jaffe, who are policy fellows at the Edward J. Bloustein School of Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers University, and founders and co-directors of the school's Center for Negotiation and Conflict Resolution. So thank you both, Linda and Sandy, for joining us today. And we're going to be talking about negotiating conflict and negotiation in the workplace. So a topic that I'm sure has touched us all in some way. So again, thank you for agreeing to speak to us. Before we jump into the presentation, I just have a few housekeeping items to go over. First and foremost, we will be taking your questions at the end of the program, but please feel free to submit them at any time using the Q&A or the chat feature in the Zoom dashboard. If you've run into a scenario that you would like clarification on, or maybe you wanted some more information on how to handle, you can also send that as well. And Linda and Sandy will be happy to comment on that and maybe give a few extra tips or context to maybe the situation that you've dealt with before. There is a copy of a handout that will be shared in the chat once we get underway. You can just open it in the chat and download it. If you do have problems accessing it, don't worry. I will make sure that everybody who registered for this in the follow-up email has a copy of that handout as well. There will be a survey available at the end of the program, so we ask that you please complete the survey. We always love hearing your feedback. So if you have time, we ask that you do complete that. And if you want more information on everything related to negotiation, you can visit the Center for Negotiation and Conflict Resolution's website at policylab.rutgers.edu/CNCR/. So, and I will again copy and paste that into the chat so you have a live link of that as well. One last thing before I jump in to the presentation, I just want to go over the Zoom dashboard for those of you who may not be familiar. This is what your dashboard should look like if you're using a PC or a Mac. If you're using a mobile device, the dashboard is going to look a little bit different depending on the device that you are using. In the bottom left-hand corner, you have your audio settings there, so you can check that in case you're running into any audio issues. If there are issues that you are having with that you can't resolve, you can always call into this program as well and listen through a phone. At any point during the program, if you run into any problems, there is a raise hand button here in the middle. You can click on that. That'll alert me. I will send you a message in Zoom and hopefully be able to help and resolve any problems that you are having. And as I mentioned before, if you have any questions or if you have any situations that you would like to kind of talk about at the end, you can either use the chat or the Q&A button there, and then that'll get sent to us and we'll be happy to address them. So that is everything that I have for you. So it's my pleasure to turn it over now to Linda and Sandy.
Hi, everyone, and thank you very much, Andrew. It's always a pleasure to be invited to do these programs, and we're impressed with the number of people who have indicated their interest in participating today. Maybe that has something to do with the presence of conflict in the world, but we know there's no end of negotiating opportunities. In fact, it's something 80% of the time you do, whether it's thinking about buying a car, selling a house, making a decision on where to have dinner, or any of those kinds of things, as well as the more major challenges in our lives. So we've been in this conflict management business for 30 plus years now, and it has become a primary concern in a number of areas of policy and planning. And so we try to draw from a lot of that in the 16-week course that we teach. So it's always a challenge to figure out how we can distill all that into an hour for you. And so what we are going to do is not have as interactive a program as we typically do, but still try to give you enough time and space to ask us questions or make some comments. I'm going to quickly go through how we organize this hour, and we'll try to leave some time at the end for specific questions. So it's almost always important to talk about the causes of conflict before we think about how we manage and resolve them. So Sandy is going to do that section, talk with you a little bit about the causes of conflict and what we typically hear from other people about how they look at the issue. Then we'll segue to what we consider a generic framework for negotiation. It's a simple 6-step framework that we think is useful in almost all circumstances. And then we're going to give you some short summations of the 4 effective techniques in negotiating and elaborate on them a little bit in 7 points, which if we don't get to are going to be provided to you in any event, and you can proceed to take a look at that at your leisure. I would just say that there is a lot of interest now in the resistance to negotiations. So if we get a chance, we'll talk a little bit about that. And what we feel is probably one of the more important things to keep in mind always, and that is that when you negotiate with someone and you expect to have a certain value coming out of that, you also have to think about the other person and what he or she or the group needs as well, so that you produce an agreement that is complied with over time. We'll reemphasize some of these points as we go through, but now we're going to turn right to the causes of conflict. Sandy?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Linda. Am I okay?
Yes,
Andrew?
you're fine. You're fine.
Yep, you look good.
Okay, good. Just to repeat 2 quick things that Linda said, because they're important. We hope you will use the chat room for questions, observations, comments, etc., or examples, because we think that's very important. The reason why I think it's very important is that we normally teach, as Linda said, using the Socratic Method. By that, I mean we ask questions, we get answers, we give a lot of hypotheticals, we give problems, we have students trying to solve the problems along with us on how to analyze. Because one of the things we emphasize in our teaching is the ability to look at a problem differently, and secondly, the ability to analyze. I think that's very, very important. So I think the Socratic Method is very important in there, but obviously the process the technology we have limits us, and we will do the best we can to try to communicate more in a lecture format than we would normally do. Okay? Just wanted to give a couple of observations. As Linda said, I usually like to start with the causes of conflict. Well, why am I doing that? What is the reason why I'm starting with causes of conflict? Well, a couple of reasons. One reason is if we don't know the cause of the conflict, we don't know how to get a satisfactory result. I am sure you've been involved in many situations where you may have had with an argument with a friend, a spouse, etc. And after 2 days, you say, what are we arguing about? What's the issue here we're really arguing about? So that's one reason. Secondly, most people are not trained to look for causes. I had the fortune of going through 3 years of law school, and never once in any of my courses do I recall one of the professors focusing on my job as a lawyer would be to train how to find out what the cause of a conflict. My job was really how to focus it in a legal framework, both an affirmative or a defensive mood. So that's one reason. Second reason is that I think it's important to think about what are some of the causes of conflict, because if we list them and talk about them, we realize how broad they are. And one of the main things you'll see when I go through my list of causes of conflict is how many causes of conflict are based upon emotional factors, personality factors, psychological factors. They're not all rational resource allocation questions. And if you're a good negotiator, you have got to learn to deal not only with the rational issues, but you oftentimes have to deal with the irrational issues. Let me give you some examples. Some of the causes of conflict are what? Anger, differences in values, different interpretations of how we value things, threats, hostility, strategy, unwillingness to negotiate, unresponsive offers, etc., lack of skill, which is a very important one, inability to analyze resource allocation. Let me give you a good example to me. Linda and I were in the process of trying to work out a resolution with the state of New Jersey, if you guys recall, something called JUA, the Joint Underwriting Association, many, many years ago that New Jersey was fostering. And there was a big settlement issue, conflict between a lot of insurance companies and the state. In the middle of one of the settlement conferences, we got one of the major insurance companies and the state together into a very productive settlement conference. And we came very close to working out a settlement that involved hundreds of millions of dollars, except for one factor. The president of the company came to me and Linda in private caucus and said, look, when these guys in the state testified before Congress on this issue, they called to be a fraud. They called our company a fraud. If they use that word again, if they call us fraud, if they call us dishonest, we're walking out of here. We're taking our money and we're never going to settle. I went to the state representative. I said, look, you guys, we want to work a deal out. It's in the best interest, obviously, of the state. Don't use these phrases. Do not color the conversation with this kind of opportunity that you have, okay? Otherwise, we're going to lose it. They agreed. We got the settlement. To me, it was a good example of how important it really is to avoid and understand the emotional factors in a negotiation. Okay, those are the.
Can I interject for a second?
Sure.
I just want to add one thing, which is a dimension on that point. There's a tendency, if anybody's been following the Amber Heard, Johnny Depp litigation, if you demonize the other, you're not likely to have a constructive conversation. And yet, we feel sometimes we're dealing with someone who is an enemy. But the thing is, if you have interests intertwined and something has to be resolved between you, you want to avoid labeling them, characterizing them in any negative fashion. You're trying to invite them into a negotiation in which there's an outcome that you need to have and he or she needs to have. So try to stay away from any kind of characterization of their intelligence, their position, or anything of the sort, and remain as positive as you can, no matter how difficult it might be.
Andrew, quick question. Am I speaking too fast?
No, I think you're good.
Okay, good. Okay, the second point I want to make, which really flows from the first one. If you know what the cause is, then you have to think about what kind of remedy you want. And you have to think about which system of dispute resolution will give you the remedy that you want and you think can resolve that problem. Let me give you an example. We have 4 different systems for our resolving conflict in our society. We have law and the courts, we have power, we have negotiation, and we have my favorite system, lump it. Okay? I'm going to go quickly through those 4 systems only because I want to give you the key attributes of each one of those systems. So when you have a conflict and you decide to do X or Y, you understand pretty clearly how you've analyzed it and what are the pros and cons of that particular system and what it can do for you and what it can't, okay? Quickly, law. Obviously, you can go to court, and we often do in our society. There are some downsides of going to court. One is the party loses control. Secondly, a third party decides for you, whether it's a jury or whether it's a judge, you're no longer making a decision. Third, and most important, is the remedy is very limited. In court, you either win or you lose. You get money damages or you get nothing. Oftentimes, though, most of the problems in our society require a broader approach. If you're worried about citing a waste dump in the ironbound section of Newark, or you're worried about issues of housing development, you don't want a yes or no answer. You want to figure out a way of dealing with that issue that's going to be satisfactory to all the parties. A court will not do that for you. Judges do not go in and resolve cases for you, okay? So that's a real limitation of the court. Plus, it's costly and it hurts relationship, which is another basic point. If you care about a relationship after a negotiation or after a conflict, if you're in a courtroom and the courtroom is over, I have never, in my experience, in a lot of trials I've had, I have never seen the plaintiff and the defendant, you walking out of court, arm in arm, hugging each other. people just don't do that because the process within a courtroom is such that it drives people apart. It does not drive people together. On the other hand, I don't want to knock the courts completely. After all, I made a living there for a long while. And so if you have an important principle you want vindicated, that's the court. If you think it's important for your concept of free speech on certain circumstances, or if you think a constitutional right is involved, you want to be in court because you may want that right vindicated. You may want the court to articulate that right in a constitutional framework so you can use it for many reasons. So courts do have a role. And obviously, if you're traveling through Arkansas and you get yourself into an automobile accident and all you're concerned about is getting a recovery for your car, you don't care about relationships. You don't care about a lot of issues. You just want to get your money. You want to get it from a court if you have to, or an insurance company, and you want to get out of there. So the court does play a very important role. The key, though, for a good skilled negotiator is to analyze when it makes sense to go to court and when it may not make sense. Okay, the second, excuse me for a minute. The second system is the power system. Good example of the power system. You work in a company. You have a real problem with a group of workers in the company. You go up to see the manager. As you walk into the office, the manager says, don't bother to put both feet over the transom. You're not sitting down. We're not working. I'm not working this out with you. I'm ordering you what to do. I want you to get downstairs and do X, Y, and Z. That's the use of power. War is a good example of the use of power. A strike is a good example of a use of power. What usually happens when power is used? The party on whom the power is exercised is usually not very happy. So therefore, relationships are not necessarily better. In fact, relationships can often be harmed after the use of power. Secondly, using power can be very costly, emotionally, economically, so forth. You also may not get little satisfaction. Also, as we know from history, not every war solves every problem exactly the way we would hope that problem would have been solved prior to going into that war. Power, when used, has all different kinds of variations and permutations. It also has inherent in it the problem of escalation. Once you start using power, you may have to go X, but if X is not sufficient, you may have to do X, Y, and Z. And once you get down the road of X, Y, and Z, you may be in an area you have never planned to be. Also, power and the exercise of power oftentimes can leave a residual of conflict and a residual of bitterness. Ask any of the people who have been subject to colonial rule how they felt many times after the end of colonial rule. Okay, so that's the other one is power. You can use that and dictate a result. My third path system, the one I like a lot, is the lumpet system. Well, you walk away. You tell the cleaners when you have an argument with your cleaners because the cleaners has fouled up the dress and you're unhappy about it, but you're not getting very far, and you just say, forget it, and walk out. You walk out and you may feel good walking out, but you have not solved your problem. And obviously you're not going to go to that cleaner again, you'll go to another cleaner. So if you lump it, you get no resolution. Secondly, it will hurt relationship. If you care again about the relationship, lumping the problem will not help the relationship. And third, the conflict may resurface. You know, one of the conflict not dealt with, when the manager suggested you go downstairs and work it out down among yourselves, oftentimes you can't work it out among yourself. It resurfaces. And conflict sometimes, when it resurfaces in a context that's worse than the original way in which the conflict surfaced. So you have to be really careful about lumping it. On the other hand, sometimes in life, it's clearly worth it to walk away. You know, somebody starts yelling at you on a road rage thing, walk away. You know, sometimes it pays to walk away from what could be an unpleasant conflict situation. Again, a question of analyzing. Analyzing what are the factors, how do you go about looking at the problem, what kind of remedy you want. And then
Yeah, just want to, can I
get
say
to
something?
our field negotiation.
Okay, yeah, well, just
Want me to
before you,
go?
yeah, before you do, just
Yeah,
want to say,
sure.
Typically, when you have a conflict, you want to get right into it. In some cases, avoid it. But the issue of how are we going to solve this? All the point that Sandy's making here is when you know you have 4 different processes or 4 different systems that you can choose, it becomes a very useful framework to use in approaching the person with whom you have a conflict, an adversarial relationship, or whatever, to say, how are we going to go about doing this? How do you want to proceed? We can always litigate. We can always try to use whatever power we have to exercise over the other, or we can ask someone for some assistance. But on the other, just getting a conversation going about the how avoids the problem itself and allows for a conversation to take place about that choice of process. And that itself can be useful because you can get people investing in it. In one of the cases we did, we had lawyers negotiating for 8 months about how they were going to go into the negotiation. And once they had invested in that process before they got to any of the substance of it, they were now so far into it, they were willing to make it work.
That was the JUA.
Yeah. And so I think one of the other things is to typically think about what's the future behavior here. As Sandy said, if there's a relationship, this is family, it's neighborhood, it's community, it's workplace, it's state-related regulatory work. You're going to have a behavior problem in the future or issues to contend with. You want to be on good terms with the people. You certainly don't want to have a continued adversarial relationship. And the 4th point here is that when implementing an agreement, relies on the parties to manage it. If you have received an order from a judge, you may not be so inclined to honor that. If you've negotiated the terms of that agreement yourselves, then by all means, you're really going to try to make it work. And since it's about future behavior, whether it's implementing a divorce and you've got children in different schools, whether it's about who owns the Statue of Liberty in Ellis Island, is what happened between New York and New Jersey, how are you going to go about dealing with the result you get? So that's another issue you want to always be thinking about before you get directly to the problem itself.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go over a couple of those points when I talk a little bit about negotiation. Okay, then my 4th system you may choose is negotiation. What do we like about negotiation? What are the factors that are important to keep in mind? Number 1, the party controls. You control the conversation. You decide what you think is important, how you want to prioritize things, how you want to deal with it. You're not leaving it up to a 3rd party to do. That's very important. Secondly, if you work a deal out, you will help relationship, not hurt relationships. And that's also can be very important to you. As Linda said, not only between you and your spouse and friends, but also your community, your neighborhood, your state, the Senate of New Jersey. I mean, all of these are relationships that we have that we want to make sure we don't harm. We want to try to help. Also, negotiation can be fairly efficient, okay? And the key thing, which we always stress in our teaching, is that the negotiators can determine the scope of the remedy, okay? You can decide what you guys think is the best way to deal with this program. Is it creating an agency to deal with pollution? Is it creating a barrier? Is it building a building in a certain way? Is it allowing for community representation? What are the 5 or 6 or 7 major things that really matter to you and to the people you represent? You can build all that into a remedy. That's very, very important. And the last point I want to make is one that Linda started to make, and that's on implementation. Every agreement, every negotiation, or even court agreement or power, and it has to be implemented. It's easier to implement something that you voluntarily agree to and that you want to live with. It's a lot easier to do that than when somebody tells you that you have to do X, Y, and Z. And one of the things we have learned over the years is that as life goes on, circumstances change, facts change, different things change. One of the beauties of negotiation is you can renegotiate the changed circumstances. No other processes do not allow. You could sure go back to court and try to litigate your divorce proceedings, or litigate child custody. It's a real pain, let me tell you that. But what you can do with the parties is get together and say, you know what? We've had a storm come through here. It has affected X, Y, and Z. I think we need to renegotiate our original agreement on flood control because we have seen different circumstances. That's an extraordinarily important point, and that can be done with good negotiators, with skill, and the ability to do it. We never would sign, Linda and I would never let the parties sign a negotiation agreement in which they did not agree to have a clause that would allow them to reopen the negotiation and provide a process for dealing with the renegotiation. I think those are really key points, very important ones. Okay, I'm going to stop for a second. I don't know, Andrew, if you want to have some chats before I move on to the framework or what? What do you think?
That's if there were no.
If there are any comments.
Yeah, there was one comment. Somebody said, I like how it goes back to positivity, just having a discussion about how to start a resolution. It's useful to think about.
Oh, good.
Okay, good. Okay.
I'll say one quick thing, which also goes along with that observation. I think there is, on Sandy's last point about renegotiating because circumstances change, there's an entire new area of the field, and it's called post-settlement negotiations. That is to say, you negotiate something, you have an agreement, you've come to terms, now you have to live with it. And it's in that framework that you don't want adversarial relationships, because you need to work out, how do we change the scope of the cleanup? How do we shift the way the waters are flowing? In the West, there's agreements between 6 states on how to deal with the water that they all use to irrigate and to drink. So these things are ongoing. They're not static. And so there's another area in which you're dealing with a future issue, and so you need to negotiate.
You know, Linda, reminds me one other point that I should make. Negotiation is also the system that allows you to hire or ask a person to function as a mediator. I mean, you don't get mediators, obviously, in power or lump it, okay? Occasionally, courts will appoint mediators, but never effective, in my opinion, where the parties agree to have X or Y as a mediator. And having a mediator, which we're not going to go into, unfortunately, we don't have the time, can be very important and very helpful. A mediator can be key in helping the parties reach a negotiation, working with the parties, helping the parties think through issues, helping the parties frame issues, helping the parties think about remedy, a whole range of issues that can help the parties deal with emotional and other factors. A mediator can be helpful. And negotiation is a system that allows for a mediator to help, either privately or publicly. A lot of times people ask the mediators and keep it very quiet, which is fine too. You decide how you want to deal with that. Okay, if there aren't any questions on those 2 subjects, let me spend a couple of minutes doing what Linda suggested I should do, which is very quickly go through the framework for negotiation. And Andrew, you can put that.
Yes, he did.
Oh, you did?
Right
Okay,
there.
great. And what that is basically is that we have studied negotiation, and if people done research on it, I mean, there are whole schools of thought now and research in negotiation have kind of distilled into these 6 or 7 concepts, ideas, factors that help you in thinking through a negotiation problem. And when we have a negotiation problem, we go through each one of these steps to figure out the best way to analyze the problem. Remember, again, I always stress analysis, and we try to teach people how to do analysis. I think that's the key in trying to work out resolutions. Okay, what are some of these factors? What do they mean? The first one is one of the most important. We do interest-based negotiation as opposed to positional bargaining. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, an interest-based negotiation is what you need, not what you want. A simple way of formulating what you need, not what you want. Let me give you a very simple example. Your young child comes home from school and wants an orange. There's one orange in the refrigerator. You go to the refrigerator and you have one orange. You also have two kids. Your other kid came home from school. I want the orange. No, I want the orange. Well, what do? You only have one orange. Well, you can argue about it. You end up saying, okay, I'm going to cut the orange in half and give you both a half. Well, that doesn't satisfy me, kid one. That doesn't satisfy me. Well, that's all I can do. Well, let's think about that's positional bargaining. I've taken a position. I'm very argumentative in my position. Interest-based bargaining. The mother says, you've been to our course, and you say to child number one, why do you want the orange? What is it about the orange you want? Oh, you know why, Mom, I want the orange? I've been thinking all day long about having the juice of an orange. That would make me feel great. I want the juice. Well, how about child number two quietly? What do you want the orange for? Well, I don't care about the juice. What I really care about is the rind of the orange, believe it or not, and the insides of the orange. I kind of like chewing on that. Kids are all different, okay? All right, so now what do? You now know what everybody's interests are, what everybody's needs are. So what can you do? You can obviously squeeze the orange and get juice and give the remnants to kid number two and give the juice to kid number one. Very simple example. If we had time, you were in our course, I would give you much more sophisticated examples. I would give you examples from negotiation, from politics. I would give you international examples and so forth, so you can see this very clearly. But that gives you a pretty good idea, I think, what the difference is between interest-based and negotiation and positional bargaining. Also, what was really key about this is that when you do interest-based negotiation, you have an opportunity to think very broadly about what other options you may want, okay? All right, so that's point number one. Am I taking that too much time? Point number two, separate the people from the problem. Or in other ways, I might frame that is how do you frame the negotiation? That's really key. Framing a negotiation is very important. Let me give you an example that uses both framing and interest-based. Many years ago, when Governor Whitman was governor of New Jersey, and a fellow by the name of Pataki was governor of New York, there came a real flap up in New Jersey and New York over who owns Ellis Island. You may recall that. New Jersey finally went to court to have the Supreme Court of the United States declare that New Jersey owned Ellis Island because of the way the lines were drawn in the original setting up of the colonies, okay? That was the argument that New Jersey used before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is the place you go if there's a jurisdictional dispute between two states. They have original jurisdiction. Okay, the court heard argument. Linda and I wrote a letter to Governor Whitman. We wrote a letter to Governor Pataki, and we wrote a letter to the New York Times. We suggested that the real issue here was not who owned Ellis Island, but there was another issue. What do you think the real issue was here? It wasn't who owned Ellis Island. New Jersey couldn't fly its flag on Ellis Island. It's a historical site. New York couldn't fly its flag. What did it mean to own it? What was really of interest was who could help develop the island. How could you have a commercial development? Who could profit from that? Who could make sure that it met the needs of both communities that Ellis Island meant so much to? Those were all their interests. So we tried to argue to the governor, both governors, that why don't you try to get together and we'll talk about interests. Guess what? We were not successful, okay? Court decided the case. The United States Supreme Court decided the case. It drew a line, gave New Jersey 2/3, gave New York 1/3. It had a line through one building. I said to Linda, you're on one side of the building, you get hurt, you fall on the other side of that line. Whose law is going to come? I mean, who cares about those issues? But that was the problem. So the failure to do it ended up in that. But it's a good example of how how difficult sometimes it is to get people to see interest-based positioning. In fact, today, we have a similar situation today in the fact that New Jersey and New York are hassling over going out of the Waterfront Commission.
Right.
And you may not know this, but Linda and I wrote an article for the paper about 3 weeks ago in which we argued we think very persuasively why New York and New Jersey should get together with a mediator and work that out. That it was just ridiculous to go to the court on that issue. And that even if you win, you're going to end up losing. You're never going to get the remedy that you're going to want to get. And that's really complicated. We won't go into it, but it's a good example. I don't know if we'll have any more luck with Governor Murphy and the new
Kathy Hochul.
and Kathy Hochul in New York. Who knows? It's sometimes very difficult for people to see a negotiation opportunity. It's a lot easier sometimes to see it differently.
Yeah. I just add one other thing on that, and that is both of those governors had constituencies, and since they had both kind of grandstanded in their state and talked about, their pride and this and that and the other thing, their state, they couldn't walk away from it. So one of the things you always want to avoid when you're dealing with conflict is don't get everybody on your side, and then you want to change your position. You're in a bad position to do that.
Right. Okay. So now we got that example. Let me take that example and relate it to the next factor, framing. Let's assume.
Well, you could say it says separate, but
same thing. Okay, let's assume that you're sitting in a room with Governor Pataki and Governor Whitman, and you turn to the governors and you say, "Governors, we're here today, and we want to talk about who owns Ellis Island, and I want you guys to talk about geography. I want you to talk about lines that were drawn in the Arthur Min Kill, and I want you to talk about an original documents from England when the colonies were set up." Okay, that's one conversation. But supposing I said to the governors, governors, I don't want to talk about who owns Ellis Island. The interests are the following. I think we should have a conversation. How can we work out a deal where your interests are met, my interests are met, we have commercial negotiation, the people who care about Ellis Island have a place to go, etc. Let's talk about that. You see the difference? One way the conversation goes with X, the other way it goes Y. It's very important for a good mediator and a good negotiator to have the skill to be able to have the conversation framed in a way that it's going to be productive. Okay? 1 second.
Yeah. Well, Sandy gets a drink of water. Let me just say that also, when you can't reach agreement on the difference between approaching a problem, say from the planning perspective, or the ownership this issue presents it, then you wind up going down a path that leads you to no good conclusion in terms of resolving the problem,
Right.
Because who owns it does not solve the problem, which is really how do we develop it, make it accessible, have some commercial value attached to it, and so forth and so on. The other thing that happens is you can often poison relationships between those that are negotiating on both sides. And so in the case of Whitman and Pataki, they had continuing problems. They severed their willingness to come to terms with how to deal with the homeless on both sides of the river. They vetoed minutes from the Port Authority. They had an adversarial relationship despite the fact they were both Republicans. And now, of course, we have two Democrats doing the same thing. So it's not only what can happen with the problem not being solved, it can also poison relationships.
Yeah, let me give you an example from the international context. One of my old friends, when the last one I have these old friends, one of my old friends, FDR, was very much involved with the British prior to the United States entering the Second World War. And the British, and Churchill particularly, very much needed a group of ships to help move cargo from the United States and other places to England, which was very important about that time. The Germans had a lot of submarines, were sinking a lot of cargo ships. Roosevelt had a great deal of difficulty dealing with an isolationist Congress. Those of you who remember your history know that the United States in the late 1930s was a place of real isolationism. And while there were some non-isolationists in the Congress, they were very few and far between. Roosevelt saw the importance of the United States supporting the British and defeating the Nazis. So he got the great idea that what we'll do is we'll tell Congress that we're not going to give them the destroyers. What we're going to do is we're going to lease them. And that they will then give us back the destroyers when they no longer need them. Obviously, not going to happen. But the concept of lend-lease was such an important selling point that he got the Congress to approve legislation so the United States could move 50 or 60 destroyers, I forget, to the British at that particular point. And that was just a very, very important concept. So you see how he framed it was very important in the subsequent negotiations. And a similar negotiation, I won't go into, but similar framing was done by President John F. Kennedy in the Cuban Missile Crisis in dealing with the Soviet Union and dealing with the with the nuclear weapons that the Soviet Union was trying to send to Cuba at that point too. So these are concepts that, as I said, are in the international scope, the national scope. They happen, I'm sure, in the Senate, New Jersey. They happen in the Congress of the United States. We have to know how to use these concepts in a productive way. The next quick point is generating options. That's one of the key things in negotiation. What we usually do in a negotiation is I will tell one of the parties, how do you think we should solve this? Give me an example. How did Massachusetts work this out? How did North Dakota work this out? How did so forth, California work this out? What I'm looking for is ideas that come from other places. For example, one of the ideas we think is very important today is the notion of creating a public bank, which the governor spoke about on one occasion, but has not moved very far. Well, one of the things that we keep on telling people who are thinking about a public bank is look at South Dakota. North Dakota, which has a public bank and has been very effective. It's a good way to convince somebody. Look at an option, think about what the option is, see whether or not it applies to you. Get people to think broadly. Never get people to think narrowly. Get them to think, what happened in Germany about this? How did England deal with this? How did Morris deal with it? Whatever you think is going to be helpful. Okay, so that's generating options. And I guess the next to last point, very quickly, is use objective criteria to persuade. Let me give you a quick problem. You want to sell a car. You have a used car, okay? You don't know how much to value that car. What do you usually do? You would go to something we call the Blue Book. You'd look up in the Blue Book of the value of the car based on the year and the condition and so forth, and set a value. So when somebody comes to negotiate with you, you say, look, I want X amount of money. That's what the Blue Book says is reasonable. What you're doing is using some objective criteria to help persuade. You do the same thing when you buy and sell a house. You look at the neighborhood, you want to see what other houses have gone for. It can be a very important part of your negotiation. And then finally, is what we call BATNA, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. What I simply mean by that is when you're thinking about negotiation and you think about the fact it may not work out, what I do is I turn to the other party and I say, what do you think I'm going to do if we don't work out? What do you think I'm going to do? Am I going to go to court? Am I going to go to power? Am I going to go to lump it? And what are you going to do? What are the consequences of what you're going to do? I want people to think about what the alternative is so they understand the process, the value of what they're in, and the importance of it. If you understand what the alternative is and understand and analyze it and communicate that to the other party, that's an important part in your negotiation. Okay? And then our last point before Linda takes over, I've taken too much of her time,
That's right.
is the value of relationships. I stress that all the time. We all have relationships. We have many, many relationships, and we will continue to have them, and they're important. It's what enables us to live in a cultured society is relationships. And how we value these relationships relates to how we deal with conflict. Because if we deal unpleasantly with conflict, it hurts it. If we do well with conflict, it helps it. And that makes it easier to do the next thing. So hopefully I've been helpful to you guys, and we'll take questions, answers. And if you don't, by the way, one quick thing, Andrew, if people don't have a chance to do it today, they can always send us emails at our website, at our office site, and we'll be happy to try to help them out.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, before Rutgers changes the screening requirements again. Andrew, if you'd be so kind, you could put up the generic negotiation techniques. All right, so let me try to go through this quickly. And I think what we'll do is not go over the 7 additional points, but they're basically covered in some respect here. But on the form that on the overhead that you'll get, on those 7 points, there's also a bit of an elaboration on each thing. And I think it's pretty self-evident in any event. So just here, what we're really talking about are several things that have come out of 20 some odd deep research projects that had observers of actual negotiations. Much of the writing prior to the last several years has been on simulated negotiations that people role play. And that's really not terribly reliable because there's not the emotional and actual commitment to a position. It's really that you're playing it. And while you can do reasonably well with it, and it's a good teaching technique, being able to observe an actual negotiation where people do have stakes in the process and in the outcome, then you learn things. And these are the points that have been learned from those studies. The first is very simple. It says ask questions. And while that seems very obvious, because if you don't ask questions, what kind of information are you going to get if it's missing? But it really does a number of things. People are very rarely unwilling to answer a question. And so you're basically opening up a conversation by asking. You're obviously insisting or prompting a response, and that is not going to be ignored. The other thing, probably even more important than that, is that you're projecting interest. And you also are saying, if I want information from you and I'm asking you these questions, I'm doing so with authenticity. That is to say, I'm not trying to get something so I can immediately challenge it. I want to listen to it. I want to hear it. I want to understand it. And so that projects a certain degree of value and respect to the position of the other. You're saying, I need to understand your perspective on this issue we're dealing with. The second thing is to test for understanding. Again, a simple proposition, but one that can be extremely useful. When you recapitulate the position or the set of interests that you've heard from the other side, if I may, and you do that in a fashion that is accurate and respectful, it says to the person you're negotiating with, oh, okay, so I did make my point, I was understood, and clearly my adversary understands what I need and why I need it. We're not saying we agree, we're saying we understand. And by saying that position of the other in a reasonable, straightforward, and comprehensible fashion, you're saying, I understand where you're coming from, I respect it, and I'm willing to deal with you on that basis. It's extremely important because all of these steps, these first 3, basically are trying to get people to understand that you've got a conversation that's worth having. The other thing is you're getting information that could be very useful in going forward. So, for example, this is extremely important in labor negotiations, particularly, which are usually rather fraught and they're within an existing framework. But the thing is, the people who are doing the negotiation have to sell it to the people who have to agree with them. So the labor negotiation has to get union agreement, and the management negotiator has to get approval by the board or whomever the person reports to. And since those people are not at the table, they are not fully cognizant of what's going on and may not fully understand or agree with why you made a concession or why you made a certain demand.
Excuse me, Linda,
Sure.
one point. That's exactly the point in the community whereby you are a representative of a community. The problem of dealing with a constituency is very real. You really hit something I think is very important to stress.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I worked for Johnson & Johnson for a while, and since I was involved in labor negotiations, there was nothing more bothersome than to finally have agreed with the union what we should do and go back to management and they say, you gave it away. No, we didn't. We listened, we understood, they understood us, and this is what we're recommending to you. And that's why you go to the next point, which is the reasons to substantiate statements and positions. You're doing two things here. You're not only trying to provide the reasons that you believe your interests should be met, you're also at the same time trying to provide your adversary reasons why you think his position, his interests should be met. So you're basically forming an agreement together rather than trying to decide between two positions. So it's a sense you're shifting to, okay, let's focus now on what we can agree to. And sometimes that means let's start constructing an agreement. Let's begin to think about what we can agree with here. What are the things we have less difficulty with? Let's deal with those first and move through the process so that we have an agreement that we can transmit to those we need to and can form the basis for our future relationship. So those are basic things that when you have that framework to be thinking about, not only what Sandy said, but also thinking about what tends to be more effective approaches to getting you there, I think they stand you in good stead. The final point about label and prefacing with constructive phrases, I mean, it's really fascinating how you observe people's negotiations and somebody starts with, well, you never pay any attention to anything I say, or I'm not sure this can work. Well, if you've already prefaced it with all these negative things, how is it likely to produce a positive outcome? But if you say, I'd like your idea, I'd like your reaction to this idea, which I think reflects both of our interests, that's an invitation. So a negotiation is not only immediately getting into the substance, it's also, again, talking about how we're going to get into it. So you always want to think about how you are framing your own approach. And since we're often angry, we're emotionally fraught, we're resistant, we're hesitant, we don't think things are fair, all of these things, you almost have to put aside in a sense to say, let me think about what the other party needs here so that we can get an agreement that we're going to be able to live with. So negotiation is not only winning what's essential to you, but satisfying the needs of the other person. Because if you don't, that agreement will not hold. And so, a negotiator is not only about what you're agreeing to today, but can it last over time? Will people comply with it? That's why it needs to meet everybody's, at least their interests minimally. So then on the 7 points, I think, Andrew, we can probably just hand that out to the participants later and spend the last 5-6 minutes, whatever we have here, with any questions they may have submitted to you. Okay?
Sounds good.
Or yeah, if anybody does have questions or they have scenarios that they've encountered that they'd like to get Linda and Sandy's opinion on, please, you can share them in the Q&A or the chat, and we'll be happy to address them. One person said that we use appraisals to value properties in an eminent domain environment. So I guess that's kind of talking about using, using something concrete in order to argue a position or something.
Well,
Yeah,
I think what that's a good example of is an attempt to get a
Objective criteria.
Objective criteria. I mean, what you're doing is if the parties agree, you want to get an appraisal to give an opinion, and then usually you'll agree to follow that opinion. Sometimes you won't. Sometimes the parties will agree to have a third party come in and then want to negotiate what the third party comes out with. But it's a good example of trying to use objective criteria to further along a negotiation. You know, there was a not similar situation. One of our colleagues were involved in a very complicated environmental negotiation off the Pacific Ocean. And the issue was whether or not the drilling of what do you call those wind turbines would affect the philo of fish, when something I know very little about. Anyway, the question was, what impact would that have on the fish? And this environmental group was upset about that, and fishermen's work, so forth. And what the parties agreed then is they agreed to go to 2 or 3 universities with an RFP to articulate a set of factors that they thought were important to agree to see if they could get some objective criteria. And then, in fact, they got our objective criteria report and then negotiated around that. So that's also a good example, somewhat analogous to what you mentioned.
Yeah, on that appraisal point, I immediately went to think about 2 things. One is that we did a lot of work with tax assessors.
Oh, yeah.
And their concerns about, really trying to give a fair appraisal of a property, and always getting resistance from the homeowner, because typically that appraisal went up, it didn't go down. And so the ways in which those tax assessors went about making their case did precisely what the commenter was saying, looking at the appraisals of similar properties, sale price, within what range of dates, and a variety of other things, so it wasn't simply saying, this is my finding and I'm living with it. Tried to substantiate somewhat of what the assessment reflected. And the other thing is that one of the things you find in negotiation that makes it such a lovely process in some respects, how there's an emotional element that can sometimes be more important than what seemed to be the major issue, money. So for example, you'll look at a house for sale, that person's selling at a certain price, and someone comes along and offers significant amount of money over it, and his or her advisor is saying, what are you doing that for? And there's no value there. And the potential purchaser says, it reminds me of my grandmother's house, and so that I've got to have it. So I mean, that's not rational, it's emotional, but it certainly can be really compelling in a negotiation. The third thing I'd say here is, one of the things negotiation allows you to do is avoid what most people would think of as, we're splitting the pie, we're compromising. I'm going to give you this and you're going to give me that.
Example.
Yeah, but sometimes you're reaching beyond it. You're finding what we would call more value beyond that original pie. There's more things you have in a relationship that you can talk about. And so, for example, we were doing a number of negotiations that had to do with the payments due on insurance policies, but it segued into, well, was there more interest on the part of one for another level of insurance than what had typically been provided? So they were able to solve the problem that got them to the table by adding more value, more interests to the discussion. And so there was greater value given in an agreement to all parties than where they potentially started.
In that case, I remember that case, they were willing to settle for, I think, something like about 90 or $100 million. It was a major cleanup case. And one of the things that really bothered the party was that they didn't think it was enough money. But when they agreed to buy life insurance and not health insurance and accident insurance, that made the deal worth it, because then they could have a long-term relationship.
Yeah.
So I think your point is so important. You not only have if you negotiate well, you not only can solve today's problem, you can also solve tomorrow's problem.
Yeah.
We also saw that in the JUA, where we're having made one settlement. One of the insurance company was able to negotiate with the commissioner of insurance and the attorney general on a range of other matters that they had before the state.
Because they established a relationship in the negotiation. Okay. Now, we don't want this to sound like it's all easy, and the root word for negotiation is not leisure. So we recognize it's difficult. It can take a certain investment, and sometimes it's time consuming, Nonetheless, it's the better process to start with because you can always use power later on, you can always litigate, and you can always walk away. So I think we're done on our end, Andrew. And as Sandy said,
we had a question come in. How do you approach somebody who is resistant to negotiation, but they're an interested party in the outcome?
That's a great question. And it's not always an easy one, and a lot depends on the personality and the circumstances and a variety of other things. But my first reaction always is there's a resistance to negotiation by people who feel not confident in the process.
Right.
You know, sometimes people send someone else to negotiate the terms for a car they want to buy because they're not comfortable in the process. So in some respects, if there's any suspicion that that might be the problem, you want to open the invitation to the negotiation by saying, I think I may be understanding some of what you need in the conflict we're having. Let's talk about how I might be able to help you as you may be able to help me. Something like that. It's an invitation to a constructive process without requiring that person to cross the threshold they don't want to cross. And if they're feeling not confident, that may make them feel a little bit willing. And that is to say, you approach it as a communication and then, you know, get to the substance of the problem. I think I don't want to suggest that you ever threaten someone, but I think taking on one of the things Sandy had said, is to approach someone and say, if we don't talk about this, if we don't negotiate some terms that we can both live with that meet both of our interests, then we're going to have a hostile relationship going forward. It's going to plague us. And I don't want to see that happen here. We need to be either in the same space, in the same family, in the same community. Let's try to see if we can work something out. So it's not sort of imposing what I want, but I'm asking you to come in and talk with me about it.
Let me just quickly add something to what Linda said. Sometimes you have a situation where, as Linda said, somebody lacks a skill or has some other emotional reasons for not wanting to negotiate. That may be a situation where a third party, a person whom you trust as a mediator or as a friend, can go speak to that person in a private caucus and try to find out what the basis for their resistance is. And once you try to find out what the basis for the resistance is, you may be able to deal with it. So we've had situations where we've been able to go over that hurdle through that technique.
Yeah, just one other point on that. One of those 7 points tells you to enlist allies. And this might be the opportunity. If the person that you want to negotiate with refuses to negotiate, and there's other people in the office, in the community, in the family, who you can enlist to be an ally to support the idea of negotiation, that might be another route. It typically, at least in academic settings, when someone's getting an assignment to be on a committee they don't want to be on because it's going to take them away from all the work they need to do for their teaching and their research assignments, but they can't convince their chair, for example, that they don't want to do that and they don't want to appear to be saying no to a person who matters to them. And they get 3 or 4 other people in the department, you know, to go along with them to say, you know, they're willing to do this piece of it. They're willing to do that part. They really want to see you do your teaching and research because they want you to be a permanent member of the department, things like that. So you're basically, it's not just you wanting something, it's having people who see it your way to also help make your case.
Okay, Andrew?
Yeah, I think one last comment, somebody summed it up kind of nice. We hear growing up that there are 3 sides to every story, yours, mine, and the truth in the middle. This is similar in negotiation. It's about coming to the middle ground.
Right. Well,
often that's true, but it's
often.
also exploring the interest to see whether you can actually find some ground that has more in it than you thought it would have.
And thinking about finding, as Linda said, expanding the pie in a way you may not have thought about it before.
But I appreciate that. That's
Right.
that's great.
Well, we would welcome any comments at our center. You have our email, and so we'll welcome looking at comments too, Andrew.
Carry on, everybody. Thank you very much.
Andrew?
I think.
Oh,
Yep. Thank you so much for presenting today. I just put the website back in the chat. They can certainly go on there and get your contact information. I will give you the personal email or the the emails for both of them in the follow-up email. Again, this is being recorded, so please look out for that as well. And I just wanted to, again, thank Linda and Sandy, thank everybody who attended, and everybody be safe, be well.
Andrew,
Thank you.
where can we get the recording?
We can talk with.
I'll send that to you.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Thank you, everybody. Bye. Have a good summer.